Thank you for the introduction, Ollie. Just as a bit of background, I'm a soil scientist and soil advisor to broadacre, horticulture and viticultural industries. And I guess try and just capture here today just a bit of a snapshot of some of the technologies that I myself have used and employed with clients of mine in certain scenarios, and take a bit of a snapshot look at some of that implementation and why I made the decision to use the tools that I did. So I guess talking on, as a topic, talking about remote soil data and also looking at the other sort of soil data layers we can capture. Soil data from a remote sense, we're trying to see what can't be seen, so trying to get the best representation of essentially satellite or remote signatures of what we think is underfoot. So for me, it's sometimes not necessarily a direct soil measurement that I need, but actually something that tells me as an indicator of what a soil condition might be that has led to that outcome. So I guess to put it into context, we've had a number of discussions on remote sensing today from NDVI, and then you've got some of the radiometrics like your gamma ray and all that sort of thing. For a lot of the public data sets are available from a soil perspective, which some companies are making that easy to get hold of, like data farming is for NDVI. You've got the companies like Farm Labs who are actually capturing some of that public access soil data when you start looking at uranium, thorium, potassium maps across a landscape which delineate macro trends in soil variation. But what we've still got to get down to is those micro trends across a managed farm landscape that we really need to manage. So linking that in then with proximal soil sensing, so that's within the proximity of the soil. So a lot of the EM38 and that side of things falls in under the proximal soil sensing. It's sort of within sort of either contact or within, say, 30, 50 centimetres of the soil. And yeah, there's some cool technology coming with the microwave sensing as well. Some of that which is satellite going down to, say, 10 centimetres, which was covered off on this morning at the DCAT discussion around that soil moisture, but also there's the microwave sensing that's going to be available to put onto a pivot or onto your spray as you're going across a field as well. So that's all coming in the pipeline. That's going to go down to about 10 to 50 centimetres. So opportunities to extrapolate more in situ data sets across the landscape. And then another piece there is a non-soil data sources. So when we start looking across the landscape, the quantity, the tonnage of yield you might be getting off across a paddock, the quality, say protein, or if it's grapes, the actual, whether it might be acidity or total tannic value and all that sort of thing. And then we start looking at NDVI, which is the actual biomass component to the above ground, but what's that telling us about the below ground? So that's sort of setting the scene on what some of these data sources are. Putting that into context, what does it mean for South Australia is, like I say, we're trying to see the unseen. So we're getting above ground data that we're trying to understand what these soil layers mean. And soils are a series of layers, and within that, depending on where the moisture sits, they're going to operate differently. So for me, that adds a level of intrigue and a challenge as well on how do we get these data sets to best represent how some of these soils are going to behave. So critically, a lot of soil data, it tries to break it down to give me a true representation of what this soil is as far as a soil type. Do we need that? Yes, it can be handy if you know what that soil type means as far as how that soil is going to behave, but really, if we can string enough layers of data together about how that soil is behaving, given a certain overlay of climate in that scenario, we can then get some insights into how we can best manage that. So we go from clays, so sand over clays, to loams. Like, how are we going to manage these differently depending if we're are we going to plant some grapes in here, or are we going to try and increase the productivity of the wheat crop, or in sort of a sandier situation where we can potentially look to opportunities to double the yield. So as I personally go and try and break down scenarios when I show up on farm and try and say, right, how I best improve the capacity of this soil, or understand what the capacity of the soil is. For me, when I look at it, if I see there's a productivity issue, if I speak to a farmer and say, I think they feel they've got a productivity issue, I'm targeting in that 0 to 30 centimetres. So what data sets can I capture that is going to give me more of an indication about my performance of that 0 to 30 centimetres? So like seeds planted to plant emergence, do we have a good ratio of that, or is there a barrier to actually water getting into that soil to germinate those plants? Is there a limitation on biomass? Is that driven from the topsoil, or is it a subsoil issue, which for me links into that productivity and then that yield potential? So at 0 to 30 centimetres, to try and break that down into, that is what we're going to set these plants up to do. And then when we start looking, if I speak to a farmer and say, righto, we're just falling short on the profitability of some of these fields, and I say, righto, we need to start digging deeper and look at those next layers down. So for me, generalisation, but at 30 to 100 centimetres. So that's driven by subsoil moisture. It has the biggest driving factor on your grain or fruit field and your resilience to climate, essentially. And like I say, gross generalisation, but breaking it down is trying to work out what is holding our system back. Is it a productivity or a profitability limitation? So critically, and in basic terms, trying to link that soil to water to plants. So what variability do we have across a landscape? What variability do I have into a landscape? And that last slide I had before, 4 of those 6 or 4 of those 8 were all from one field that was going to be planted to vines. So we've got to understand what that variation is. Water, soil moisture content, and then its relative moisture content when we start extrapolating some of these data sets out. We can get an in situ reading like it was touched on this morning, have a moisture probe in the field, and then we can extrapolate that out on a relative data sense. So how good is that data? We've then got to essentially ground truth and validate. And then the plants, so the NDVI, yield, protein, we're talking about a grain crop, we can start working forwards and back to get a better idea of what our soil limitations are, and not necessarily the soil type, but where the soil limitations are occurring within the profile. So I thought I'd just try and break down my use cases of some ag tech integration into farming situations from a case study perspective. So working with field systems, we had a big push on helping farmers with their strategic tillage decisions. A lot of farmers will just get their tillage implement, might have been sitting around the farm from the 90s. The horsepower level has gone up significantly since the 90s, early 2000s, and literally it's usually set to when do the wheels start slipping as the depth that we're going to go. That doesn't always work when it comes to then how productive that crop's going to be on the other side. So how can we start making better decisions around the go, no-go on the depth of some of these soil changes? So this scenario, sand over clay soils, non-wetting soils, so they're soils that literally you can pour 20 litres of water on and then kick the dirt and it's still dry. So with that, we've got to work out how to get water into those soils. One option is to increase the clay content of those soils, get it above 5% clay, and we can start improving that water infiltration. The issue is that unknown depth of clay underneath the soil. Some of it you can roughly predict off some yield maps and that sort of thing, but there's a lot of variation around what the depth of that clay layer sits across a landscape. There have been traditional EM38 data collection units, so electromagnetic, so picking up the conductivity of the soil across a landscape. Traditionally has occurred in 2 bands, so a 0 to 50 centimetre band and a 0 to 100 centimetre band. We came across some technology out of Austria where they'd actually been using a 4-band EM38 metre, which they'd actually been using to pick up where the moisture was sitting in the clay soils of Europe to work out if they were going to go too deep for moldboard ploughing when they were smearing the clays and had other soil behaviour issues. We thought, hang on, that's a good opportunity for Australia, sand over clays, pick up that depth of that clay and get a better map for that strategic tillage go, no-go areas and the capacity to hit that clay. So that gives us 4 layers within a metre of the topsoil, so it gives us essentially 20 centimetre increments down the profile to capture where that clay is sitting. We can then, on the flip side, we then put in some of those moisture-limited zones, moisture probes with a weather station, one before we'd go into it to work out our inefficiency. So we can see we've had an inch of rain, but only had about 10 mils of that 25 mils go into the soil. So we can then gauge that product improved performance gain out of that rainfall, where for every 25 mils of rain, we want to make sure we get 25 into the soil. So we had the weather station and moisture probes set up to link in with that. So ultimately, we can then get these 4-layer maps going down through the profile. So basically, the more red you get, the more clay content you've got in those soils. So going down the profile, we're working across and then down to here in a Z pattern. We've got this clay coming up essentially in these subsoils. So do we have capacity to reach them? In certain areas, yes, we can with a ripper. Other areas, we might need a delver, so to get down deeper and suck that clay up. And other areas, we can target with a spader if it's in, say, within 30 centimetres of the surface. So we did this mapping for one example over on Kangaroo Island, 150 hectares. We mapped it. We found that clay was too deep in one area, but we knew it was accessible, so we clay spread that area and then spaded that in. And another area, we had clay within the surface within reach of the soil with a spader, and we were able to spade that area. So productivity went from a canola crop that had a very patchy establishment, very poor return on investment overall, to then flipping that round into a wheat crop which had 100% ground coverage and turned itself into a 5-tonne wheat crop this year. So just using those decisions to make, using those decision support tools to make a better decision has been a critical thing on a massive sort of cost base, which, so for a, call it potentially a $10 per hectare investment in the mapping component, you've made a better decision around $150 to potentially $400 a hectare soil management decision. Case study 2 is an improved nutrient management scenario. So looking at variable nitrogen and water use efficiency across a landscape, especially in large fields, this is in the broadacre cropping sense. The management issue has been decision on N rate to apply and the accuracy of variable rate options. So if you just go off, say, NDVI biomass imagery, we've got a shortfall on does the biggest biomass going to convert through to grain? Maybe, maybe not. The biggest biomass, if we don't get any moisture, may be the crop that then part of the crop that fails, or if we have a low biomass area, you think it might be the poorest performing area, but due to the lower biomass, it actually is quite efficient on its grain production. So trying to work out how do we make better decisions on that. Tim touched on it earlier from data farming about yield mapping, like the amount of yield mapping that's been done that has just not been utilised. Like there's stacks and stacks of data sitting on farmers' harvesters that is underutilised. We came across the protein mapper about 6 or so years ago, and with that we're like, hang on, this is not just for moving grain around to work out your yield and protein and all your pay grades when you go and deliver grain. This is a great indicator tool to work out soil performance across a landscape. So these crop scan by Next Instruments protein meters sit on the harvester and will pick up the protein in the grain every 10 seconds as it's going across a landscape. So with that, we get essentially a nitrogen map being built across an area. So for every tonne of grain, depending on its grain protein density, it might range from 20 through to 28 units of nitrogen per hectare that it's using, and we've got this variation across a landscape. So we then group these paddocks, so you get the yield and the protein, group them into management performance zones, so high yield, high yield, high protein, high yield, low protein, low yield, low protein, low yield, high protein. We want to target the green zone. Nitrogen is limited in the yellow zone. The blue zone is showing your moisture limited zone, and your red zone is your N limited zone for your entire of the season, where usually your yellow zone hasn't had enough N to fill the grain at the end of the year. So we can cluster these areas and use this data for the next year to make better nitrogen decisions, because interesting, where you've got these higher protein levels, it'll still consistently, when you go on deep N test them, they'll still be having a carryover of nitrogen still left in those soils. So year on year, over the 3 to 5 year period, we're stacking these data layers and find the trends in these fields are the same. So we can then work out, right, why is this consistently a blue area? Being a moisture limited zone, we can actually make a true soil management decision change. So with that, we can then group the areas across sort of your wheat productivity zones. So green, we want that to spike as high as possible. Blue, is moisture limited. So was it the soil type related, or is there another inefficiency there? And the low-hanging fruit here is the red and the yellow. That is just a nitrogen management decision in those areas that we could be doing better. So you've got, what's that, about 18% plus another 5%. So you've got 20 to 25% potential just on improved nitrogen management that we could have made a better decision about last year. So with that, we can then make these nitrogen use efficiency maps. So across the landscape, we can pick up the inefficient zones that essentially, if you've got a very high nutrient use efficiency or nitrogen use efficiency, which it means we're actually mining the organic pool. And if we've got a low efficiency, it means we're obviously got a low efficiency, and why are we throwing more at it if we don't need to be, if it's not utilising it? So trying to close the gap on these windows on essentially all above ground data. It's all yield and protein, but once it's linked together, it's telling me so much more around the soil condition and where these soils are holding us back. And these maps will flop around depending on if you have a wet year or a dry year, which once you stack those layers together, for me it's saying, righto, if it works really well when we get lots of small rains, our topsoil is performing really well, but the years when we do rely on subsoil moisture and they're not giving us back, we need those years to really highlight what we need to be doing about those subsoils. Case study 3, just to bring it home, is we've really focused with Platt Farm on trying to get more innovative solutions to targeted soil mapping and soil data collection. And with that, we sort of pivoted off the soil carbon baselining and monitoring. That there's a lot of complexity in that methodology, and we had to simplify the rollout of that program. So working with Platt Farm and the MLA and with private growers as well, trying to work on how do we simplify this whole process. We've got to group the areas to soil type, get the boundaries, use better sort of soil data to delineate the variation. Critically, when you're measuring soil carbon, you want to know the variation across the landscape, essentially more than you want to know the actual number of what your percentage of soil carbon is. Because once you know the variation, you can then start managing for that and then implement the management changes to start evening that up. So deployment of that sampling strategy, tracking the management and modelling the improvement is where we've been able to link in with Platt Farm to deliver those solutions. So we can have a targeted management strategy, identify the base variability and then plan for that variability, because if you don't have the opportunity to plan for that variability, you're back at square one with your sampling management plan. Once you manage for it, you can then, once you've got that measurement, you can then implement it. And on the small scales, for the guys who don't have all the $20,000 kit to get auto steer in your tractor, when using Platt Farm to then hit the go, no go on the implementation of or application of, say, compost or fertilisers in a vineyard sense especially, and also in a pasture sense where some of the guys, like I say, don't have the technology for all that auto steer and variable rate application, that we can strategically do that through Platt Farm. And then that subsequent monitoring or tracking the changes, quite often dealing with guys who are very passionate about soils and soil health, is they've got a measurement from about 5 years ago of one site where they had 1% carbon, and they come back and they measure one site again and it's gone to 2% carbon, and they say I've doubled or I've gone up a full percentage point on my soil data, when really I probably could have picked that up in 1 year just by testing in 2 different sites myself, you know what I mean? And we just got to build this right data set so we can really track and trace what is working on the different soil types and for the different environmental conditions. So the more data we can stack in there to then track, the better. So for strategies for me for understanding the soils is using a combination of data. For me, it's in situ, so from moisture probes and weather stations in the field. Quite often that'll be our base starting point of in situ data, as well as the soil pits is a critical thing. Proximal soil sensing, so within essentially proximity of the soil, so like the EM38 and there are more sensors coming, like I say, on that soil moisture. And the remote sensing is great for that more of that macro level on the trends, like was touched on the NDVI, the gamma radiometrics, which are all becoming easier and easier to source and implement. And then critically, those non-soil data sources. Like once we've got those base macro trends, what soil data, non-soil data sources can we stack on top to actually give us a better indication about the performance of the soils? Because we need to know more about that performance and behaviour than we do necessarily about the actual true soil type. And then track those changes and seasonal variability. Like I say, that is the biggest thing for me. If I have the data that show me a dry year, show me a wet year, and I'll show you where your problem is, that is a massive starting point for me. And then critical to link the right variables. Make sure you're asking the right questions of your data. Make sure you're asking the right questions of the person who's collecting and interrogating your data to make sure you're not extrapolating an error. and make sure you're extrapolating the right information that's actually going to be beneficial to you. And where sensors have their limits, your sensors come into play. So don't underestimate the power of a shovel when you start talking about soils. Everything for me needs to be ground truth. Essentially put your finger on the pulse, calibrates essentially your whole system, and then you've got confidence to move forward on. So that summarises me. Hopefully it's given you a bit of an insight into sort of processing some of the ag tech data solutions. Some of those units that we've been involved using is actually on display at the Emmett's stand with the Agree team. They've been great to work in on actually implementing this sort of technology on the ground at a greater broad scale and horticultural level. Thank you.